Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Saturday, February 1st, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the 2026 Senate elections. Yes, you heard me correctly, the 2026 Senate elections. Now you might be wondering, why are we talking about this? Well, things are quite simple. Democrats are now sort of saying, not publicly, but in private, enough so that Axios can get a scoop on it, that they are now willing to fight unwanted candidates in Senate primaries so they don't have to worry about them as being unelectable later down the line. Let me walk you through the 2022 Senate elections for the Republican Party and why this is something that Democrats might be looking at as something that they need to do, looking ahead to 2026. In 2022, the Republican Party left Donald Trump to essentially endorse whoever he wanted to run for Senate, and that would be the party nominee. The NRSC adopted an official policy that they would not be meddling in any of the Senate elections. Same thing in the House races from the NRCC, and the same thing from the National RNC. They pretty much said, why should we decide what the voters want in this primary? Why should we decide what people can say or do on the campaign trail? Why should we nudge certain candidates in or out of races? Well, might I present to you the election results of the 2022 Senate races. Then we fast forward to 2024. Now, arguably a strong year for the Republican Party, but not strong enough. Allow me to explain. Well, when it comes down to the types of candidates that they ran, especially given how beneficial the year ended up being, there were far more winnable races that Republicans ultimately fell through on. Notably, the state of Nevada, which Donald Trump won by a margin of roughly 4 points. Jackie Rosen ran against Sam Brown, who was far too extreme in the first place to run, who ended up losing by roughly 2 points. In Arizona, a state that Trump won by 6 points, Democrats won that Senate race by over 2 points. Why? Well, Kari Lake ran for governor 2 years prior, never conceded the race, and ultimately ended up becoming one of the most unpopular Republican figures in the state of Arizona. Over in Michigan, sure, Democrats were worried with Elisa Slotkin and Mike Rogers, but there were better Republicans. John James probably would have won this Senate race, but again, they didn't want to meddle. In Wisconsin, Eric Hovde became the de facto Republican nominee with all of these major endorsements and all of this support and all of this money, only to lose the general election later down the line. And then looking back at 2022, I realized I didn't give you the quick run through, but allow me to walk you through it again. In Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz was the Republican nominee, not for anything but Donald Trump's endorsement, ended up losing the general election. Herschel Walker was pushed by Donald Trump to enter into the race, and subsequently ended up losing the general election. What we saw with Blake Masters in Arizona, same story. What we saw with Adam Laxalt in Nevada, same story. What we saw in New Hampshire with Don Bolduc, same story. All across the board, those who Donald Trump chose in many of these races, with the exceptions of Wisconsin and North Carolina, ended up losing their bids. Now we're looking at what Democrats are looking to do in 2026. Well, learning from the Republican Party, which was the opposition party at the time, failing to, really capture, the best types of candidates, and instead deferring to somebody like the former president to make these endorsements. And in this case, the comparable, point would be Biden, Harris, whoever. Democrats are saying they're going to push out those who are the weakest and end up supporting the best and avoiding as many inter-party fights as possible so all of the money can be spent on the general election. If you remember back in 2024, there was also one Senate race in particular, 2 Senate races in particular, where the amount of money spent was way more than necessary in the Democratic primary. The first one I will mention is the state of California, which ultimately ended up with a 2-way race of Adam Schiff versus Steve Garvey. But ultimately, what we found in this top 2 primary was so many candidates ran and tens of millions of dollars was spent on a race that is otherwise safe blue. Now, I get it. California is a state that represents 1 in 8 Americans. It would make sense for an extensive primary, and although it costs a lot of money, the media markets are quite expensive in San Francisco, San Diego, and especially the Los Angeles area. But on a lesser known area, the state of Maryland, my home state, Angela Alsobrooks, Prince George's County executive, now United States Senator, faced a very competitive primary against Representative David Trone. Representative David Trone and the race with Angela Alsobrooks, what we found here was that the amount of money spent into it was in the tens of millions. And for what? A general election that ended up being far more competitive than most Democrats would have hoped. After all, this is a safe blue state that was decided by roughly 12 in the Senate general election. And so we look at this and we ask, why are the Democrats focusing on this? Well, it's because if that $50 million that was spent in Maryland and the $40 million that was spent in California could have been spent elsewhere, maybe some of these results would have looked a little bit different. Now, West Virginia was far gone and Montana was too, but Ohio and Pennsylvania were a little bit closer. But what hurt the most, I think, neighboring to Maryland, was Pennsylvania for Democrats, where they lost a race here by roughly 15,000 votes out of nearly 7 million cast. That matters to Democrats. They look at this and say, this is an absolute failure on our end because we had the money. We had the areas to fundraise and to spend, but instead of it being focused on states that really matter and a general election that really matters, they were focused and caught up in a primary. Now, the National Democrats are saying, we're in this to win this. We're going to choose the right candidates. Kirsten Gillibrand, the chair of this wing of the Democratic Party. Chuck Schumer, the major highest-ranking Democrat in the United States Senate. Both of them are in alignment that they are going to focus heavily on making sure that there's not as much inter-party fighting, that there's not as much money being spent on primaries, and that these resources and this time and all this opposition research is instead being focused on nothing better for them than the general election. And so that's what matters here. The Democratic Party is ready to get involved into this because, after all, these Senate races are not going to be won easily. There are 3 races Democrats are looking to in particular in the 2026 Senate races: the state of Maine, state of Michigan, and the state of Georgia. Now, Democrats never really thought Michigan was going to be as competitive. Gary Peters' retirement at 66, which I know sounds normal to any, average, working class American, but in politics, that's young. And 66 is when Gary Peters ultimately said, I'm not running for re-election. Now, Democrats are quite upset about that because it means that Michigan is going to have a contentious primary, probably a very expensive one, with 2 representatives that are considering bids, a former secretary from the Biden admin considering a bid, Pete Buttigieg, and all these different people that are considering, spending money, spending time, spending resources to win a primary, and they might not even win the general election. Democrats look at this and say, this really shouldn't be happening in a year where the entire focus should be on opposing Donald Trump and winning general elections. A big plus for Democrats in 2022 was that the National Democratic Party was able to make sure that every single Democrat running in this race was running for re-election. Every single Democrat possible. With the exception of one Democrat in Vermont, every single Democrat stayed in this race. 2022 was looking like it was going to be a bloodbath for Democrats, to put things into context. Republicans were dominating in the national popular vote. They were expected to win numerous Senate races by significant amounts. Washington and New Hampshire had been classified as toss-ups by almost everybody across the board, and it looked like Republicans were on track for a wave. And yet, not at one point in time did any of these vulnerable Democrats say, I'm stepping aside and not running for re-election. In 2024, it was a very similar situation. Now, in 2026, we already have one Democrat out in Michigan and potentially more. But Democrats are looking to bypass those competitive primaries by ensuring that their incumbents run again. And in the case that there are unwanted Democrats, meaning Democrats who might be popular with the Democratic Party base, but are polling 5-6 points behind their Democratic counterpart, the National Democrats seem like they're going to get involved. It's this type of politics that, sure, is very brute force and very much is involved in trying to, shape the way races go before voters can even get the chance to vote on them. And it's the same thing Republicans do. This is the way politics is done. But because Republicans didn't adopt that in 2022 and 2024 out of fear of pushback against the former president, now the incumbent president, Democrats don't have a figure that they are afraid of, quite frankly, pissing off by deciding that they are going to invest in races. And if this main focus is winning, which now Ken Martin, the new chair of the National Party, has decided to say, this is his priority, we're taking the gloves off, we're doing what's hard, we're doing what's necessary, falls right in line with the same type of language and the same types of things we are hearing from these national Democrats who have the power, who have this concentration of being able to pick and choose, what to do, when to do it, who to run, how to run them. These are the things the Democrats are starting to look at and say, if we don't want to see what happened to us happen again, we need to ensure that before the primary, we're vetting the right candidates. Before the general, we're avoiding the primary, right? We're avoiding a contentious primary. We are, in many cases, we saw this in 2021 in the earlier stages before the Republican Party started to push away from doing that in subsequent years. We saw that in 2021, in the Virginia governor's race, Amanda Chase, a state senator who was an election denialist, very unpopular amongst the average suburban voter, was not going to win the general election in the way that Glenn Youngkin was going to, and probably would not have won it at all. She was likely going to win that primary. She was polling at 30%. The vote was getting split across 6-7 different candidates. And so what the Republican Party did in the 11th hour switched over from a primary to a convention system, ended up with only the party elites being able to decide. They reached out to them individually and said, we need Glenn Youngkin, not Amanda Chase. She loses the election. Instead of going third party, she endorses Glenn Youngkin. Best case scenario for them, they have a really strong 3 months. They go straight into that general election and they win the general election. But they never repeated that lesson ever again. And so now in 2026, what we're going to see here likely is over-involvement from national Democrats, likely is over-involvement from some of these chairs that might have nothing to do with the average race in Michigan, Georgia, or Maine. But these Democrats here are going to make, inroads and going to try to field the right candidates, making sure that it is the right type of representative who will vote party line, but also be the most electable, will be running in this race. Because all in an effort to avoid a contentious primary, a very devastating primary in some cases for Democrats where they are weakened so much they cannot win in the general election. And it looks like Democrats, unlike what they have done on their side in years past, are willing to get far more involved in what is happening in these, few elections and these earlier on elections, rather than just involving themselves later down the line, which might be a smart move for Democrats, looking at it strictly from the situation of electability and what needs to happen now with Donald Trump being in office for a second time, and 2026 and 2027, and of course, in 2028. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch, then a playlist for my 2024 post-election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.